Hello, honeys, and welcome to your Highbrow Honey Pride 2024 special. In this episode, we are going to be looking at representations of gay America, at least in the 90s, in three very well-known, celebrated, or controversial photographs and photo series. Because time is short and we are trying to work, bitch, let's go ahead and get started. Here's your brief little personal sappy bit about me being a community member and loving the gay time. I think I incidentally came out to my mom, who was the first family member that I did so with, in a June or a July. Nice timing past me. I have also enjoyed deeply bonding moments at Pride, like my first time at the Chicago parade and in kind of queer-dominated spaces like rugby teams or specific cafes and clubs, various ad hoc groups that just become social regulars. We just love supportive communities, and I really wanted to take a moment to appreciate and recognize mine. I'm not saying all this to soapbox at all, but just to explain a bit if you don't already know why we at Highbrow Honey care about Pride Month and why we're recognizing it. These are the reasons. A quick note about those three series we're going to talk about today. These are a little older, and that's a bit intentional. I want us to think about where we were in the 90s, especially when we know where we are today with the resurgence of anti-queer legislation and sentiments across the USA. So we're looking back a little bit this episode to see where we have been and where we could be again, or maybe even one day improve from. So, to kick us off, an incredibly short, condensed history of admittedly Western-leaning LGBTQ+ depiction in the visual arts. Basically, there is not a single time, culture, geography that is exempt. And I do mean no time period. We're talking antiquity and classics, and yes, there are in fact cave drawings of homosocial activity, especially in Adwara, Sicily. No, those are not particularly explicit or detailed, to the point that historians are actually still debating if they are in fact homo relations. However, the sand cave paintings in Zimbabwe are clearly of gay sex, no mistaking it. As popular culture has come to recognize more and more in recent years, the Greeks and Romans had no problems depicting all sorts of X-rated homo activities. For example, we can look to the marble sleeping hermaphroditus, the depictions, all of them really, of Achilles and Patroclus, depictions of the lesser-known pair of warrior lovers, Harmodius and Aristideon, the infamous Sappho of Lesbos, the list goes on and on. Now, sometimes, like in the first case, Sleeping Hermaphroditus, this was a necessary part of depicting a character. He was a son of Aphrodite and Hermes, who's mythologically known for having both male and female physical as well as sexual characteristics, hence the more recognizable medically derived terms referencing his name. But the other cases, that's a result of individual artist interpretations of relationships between such titular characters. So a more intentional and potentially a more accepting view of the depicted relationships. Other cultures, however, with the exceptions of certain short-lived periods in what would become China, were much more likely to portray hetero relationships as well as people, though arguably more graphically at times. There are a few records from ancient Egypt in terms of certain depictions of intimacy between two male high officials of the pharaoh Noisire. I will publish their names because I am trying my best, and honeys, I simply cannot. I can't say them. Meanwhile, Harper's Bazaar of India notes, quote, "While there are no explicit mentions of the queer community in ancient Indian culture, there has been several references to them. For instance, the Shikhandi is hinted to be a trans man in the epic Mahabharata. The carvings on the walls of the Khajuraho temple depict female homoerotic relationships," end quote. As time goes on, Europe gets a little fruity, literally, in the sense of their still lifes, especially in the Renaissance. So does the Islamic world. For Renaissance examples coming out of Europe, you can look straight at Donatello and Michelangelo's Davids. Or if you would like an in-depth analysis of those two statues, you can listen to our episode on it, Season 2, Episode 4. But as far as we know, not much queer art came out of South or Central Americas, or even any African nations at this time. That's not necessarily the case for the Middle East, notes Epoch magazine. Quote, numerous works of poetry and art which were created centuries after Prophet Muhammad received God's message suggest that for a certain period of time, homosexual relationships were visible in the Muslim world. End quote. For example, they point to the Haft al-Rang, or the Seven Thrones, by the celebrated Persian poet Jami of 1414 to 1492. The volume contains at least 2 stories in which an old man attempts to court a beautiful young man unsuccessfully. They are problematic as both of the old guys die in the end, but there's still depiction and acknowledgement of homoerotic desire and relations as a social reality. After a few hundred years of relative openness, however, both regions shove this all back into a deep dark closet until about the 1800s, allowing only hints of queerness to peek out here and there, largely through symbolism in individual works. But once we hit that 19th century, Europe gets gay, largely led by French and British artists in visual depictions. There's this interesting sort of coding shifts across the century as social attitudes towards queerness shift in both nations. For example, after 1861, in British art, the hints towards queerdom or queer relations, queer desires, increases slightly, and this is the year that the death penalty for sodomy was abolished in Britain. The Tate Museum notes parallels between this and further increasingly obvious addressing of same-sex intimacy and attraction, gender fluidity, etc., with the 1967 partial decriminalization of sex between men. After that point, too, there was an increase in the graphic nature of depictions, an increase in the visibility and representation of queer people. The Tate makes note of several other major impact moments across the 19th century that helped increase queer visibility, especially in artwork and often social positions as well. The trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895 for gross indecency and Radcliffe Hall's novel The Well of Loneliness in 1928 for supposed obscenity were huge moments for public debate, public knowledge, public acknowledgement of everything queer. The 19th century also saw the beginnings of so-called official and so-called scientific classification systems. These systems were in part created by social perceptions and emerged as part of public consciousness and talk. And queer people did have their, albeit not very pleasant, but still places within these quote-unquote official, quote-unquote scientific classification hierarchies. Victorian-era British examples of, queer representation in art could be varied, could be much more or much less obvious, though it was fairly common for such artists to look towards antiquity, classics, other more quote-unquote gay art periods to mimic and get away with increased focus on male bodies or socially taboo relationships in their own artworks. For specific examples of what that might have looked like, the Tate points towards Frederick Leighton's sensuous male nudes, as well as Evelyn de Morgan's depictions of Jane Hales. Shout out here to my cohort member, Jacob Robertson, who did his thesis on De Morgan. Again, not much on the record, at least, for queer art, visibility, representation in the same regions I mentioned before, African nations, Central, as well as South Americas, so on. And yet here again, we see some representation coming out of the Islamic world. Says Epoch, quote, two miniatures recently sold by Sotheby's were attributed to Abdullah Bukhari, an 18th century Ottoman court painter, and represent much more explicit forms of homoerotic art, even though the men depicted there are fully dressed in bright clothes. On the first miniature, one man mounts and penetrates the other. On the second, another man, whose masculinity is reinforced by the mustache, tightly embraces his lover, end quote. The 19th century comes to a close and the 20th opens and keeps that ball right on rolling. As the 20th century carried on, queer art became more prevalent, more explicit, more bountiful, and more in line with major art movements such as minimalism and action art. Yet the beginning of the 20th century is pretty fascinating for how openly it began, relatively openly, at least according to the tape. They note that gender-bending musical performances, dance acts of male and female impersonation acts, as they were called then, were very popular, yet also seen as innocent family fun. Pretty astounding considering how drag queens are dragged through the mud today. Because of strict censorship at the time, very few directors were able to find ways to make positive and explicit depictions of queer lives and experiences, yet they did their best, those who tried. As we can imagine and have since learned about, many celebrities who were in same-sex relationships at the time tried to keep them from public view, though they were often also open secrets. Some celebrities, like Laura Knight, laid claim to traditionally masculine sources of artistic authority. They would paint themselves in the act of painting nude female models. Others had open marriages or same-sex relationships, and still more, like Claude Calhoun, questioned the very concept of gender binaries. Of course, as the century goes on and across every corner of the globe, things are much different in terms of symbology, legal restrictions, and social norms, plus individual terms of intimacy, not to mention a dozen other factors. So it's pretty hard to track throughout that last century without special and intense research what exactly all these queer art themes and queer artists emerging were, but it's very safe to assume, just because of the sheer quantity of the art, that even if some of it didn't have explicitly queer themes, some of it was being created by queer people. The 20th century is very much in parallel to the 19th in terms of things just continuing to open up and grow. You've got increasingly obvious references to same-sex relations, queer themes, gender fluidity, questions raised by or shown in artworks. And though we can, and I do plan to in future Pride specials, talk about some of the artists who drove queer expression, especially to explicit points in the 20th century, suffice now to list a few major names in, first, parallels of artist dress and gender expressions across time. By looking at it across centuries, you could look at Rosa Bonheur to Lily Elbe to Vaginal Davis. In terms of male fantasy and desire across the 20th century through artistic depiction, you can look at the works of Tom of Finland, Whitdorf, Hartley, Herring, and Wagnerich. Suffice to say that the 21st century has seen questions, expressions, etc. from the 20th century, as well as new ideas further driven forward, made increasingly complex, often skewing politically related or inspired, and all the more focused on the individual within a cultural context. And with our super brief historical representation bit out of the way, let's talk about those three series that I mentioned at the top of our episode. The first one we have is by Nancy Andrews, so let's take a minute for her brief biography. She was born in rural Virginia in the 1960s to a very pastoral farm life, and in multiple interviews has noted the close nature of the community lifestyle she experienced as a kid. She first realized she was gay in the late 1980s, in her late 20s, and has worked in many mediums. She's also published for the Detroit Free Press, ESPN, and West Virginia universities. She is also a co-founder of the Free Film Festival. Andrews, by her own descriptions, sees photography and many of her series as made up of two parts. One is how an artist uses visual realities of an image to make order out of chaos, and the other is how exactly they show or share it. This duality and how much concern it shows for the experience of the viewer results in a real vulnerability and uniqueness in her images. There's a sense of self-consciousness that is very touching. So the main series of hers that we're going to be talking about today is called Family, a portrait of gay and lesbian America that was produced throughout 1993. A quick clarity note on that title as we begin here. It's both referring to the photographic series in addition to the exhibition format of the photographs that debuted at the same time. There are multiple reasons we decided to cover this series in our Pride special, but most of it has to do with the very intimate nature of the photographic series. It was certainly an unusual, if not groundbreaking, exhibition. The National Gallery of Art notes that it, quote, brought together Andrews' photographs from more than 5 years of traveling the country, interviewing and photographing gay and lesbian Americans, end quote. The release of the photographic series in a book format was celebrated by the New York Times as, quote, an important record of 20th century gay life and a joy to read, end quote. The writers over there additionally praised it for its, quote, soulful depiction of people as simply themselves, end quote. The 1993 Family series was such an important moment for visibility because it allowed some queer people who had never seen visual records of other queer people to have that experience. This was especially new and exciting because it allowed queer people to see other queer people just existing and going through daily life, and that had been rare, if not impossible, to see prior to this, at least in such a public way. How Andrews found the subjects for her photographic series is a story in itself. She subscribed to something called the Gay Yellow Pages, as well as gay newspapers across the nation, making use of travel times built into her work schedules and taking referrals by various local organizations and other recommenders seriously. Andrews says regarding the early days of the series, quote, I realized I had an obligation. If the work was going to help someone like me, it could very easily help someone who is different from me, didn't look like me, didn't talk like me, was a different race or religion. Yet still, it's not everything. I had to be very narrow in a certain sense. It was really just looking at gay men and lesbians, or that part of someone's life, end quote. So we keep beating around the bush of why exactly this series is significant not only to Andrews herself, but to the social and art historical records as well, especially for queer visibility. So let's get a little more direct. Why exactly it matters to Andrews. Though she saw the community of her youth as very loving, she did not see queer people like herself in it. Queerness was a hushed topic, and she saw this series as an opportunity and, quote, process for her to find out, who am I? Who are my people? End quote. On her own website, as I keep alluding to, she describes wanting to find community, wanting to reflect the diversity of our world so that many people would be able to find images of, if not exactly themselves, people who could very well be a stand-in because they were alike. And that is partially why the Family series is so important to sociocultural records, is because the stories behind it are broad, unique, and yet human, and therefore relatable. Everyone in this series had their own experiences to represent. For example, Mary Cortland of Maine. Though she lived alone, she had some other helpers and seemed like a perfectly normal woman who just by chance never had kids. That is, until Andrews got to talking with her and learned that Cortland had been kicked out of a convent as a young novitiate for kissing another nun. In Andrews's photograph of her, she's 89, sitting near her front door with her purse on her lap, just ready to go to the store. And Andrews expresses this desire to have someone recognize a bit of their auntie or their grandma or even their great auntie in that photo. The series has another unique yet relatable aspect to it in that each participant chose to demonstrate their own lives differently. They chose other adjectives before gay, other descriptors, as Andrew says. This series represents the intersectionality, the multiplicity of identities, how no one person is just one thing. Another standout aspect of the family series is the important sense of bravery behind every sitter's participation in the project. As the National Gallery of Art notes, in the interviews, people would mention that their parents didn't know, and Andrews in turn would ask, well, what if they see your picture? And the sitters would just say, okay, well, I guess they'll know then. Of those conversations, Andrews says, quote, the yearning that I felt to find people, other people also had that urge. They realized that we're this invisible group of people. The one way for us to have our rights and to not be discriminated against is to lose our cloak of invisibility, end quote. She likened the photography project as a whole to being a younger version of oneself and choosing what exactly is true to you as you're discovering your sexuality for the first time. The series is very extensive, so I'll just point out a few major images. The first is by far the most famous to come out of the family series. It's an image of Jean Harwood and Bruce Miro. It's notable for the very simple composition of a man leaning over to kiss his partner, a wheelchair user, on the cheek, with the background indicating that they are in some sort of senior or possibly medical care facility. The photograph was, in fact, taken in '93 as Jean said goodbye to Bruce in his room at the nursing home. Andrews provides a short summary of their relationship by saying that they first kissed on New Year's Eve in 1929, and by the time she met them 63 years later, they were still together, though by then, Bruce had come down with Alzheimer's. She notes the two were the oldest couple that she was able to photograph for the book. Jean's own retelling of their story is breathtakingly beautiful. The years they were closeted and the years they were not, the times they were forced to live apart and wrote poems to each other that were set to music by the other, as well as these more troubled later years since Bruce's disease has advanced. Their tale is as tragic as it is happy, as it is moving, and that is the purpose of the family series. Some other images of note include two of lesbian Elvises taken in 1993, one named Lee Crow, photographed in a San Francisco apartment, the other in Missouri. A photograph of the two openly gay Congress members in '93, Barney Frank and Jerry Studs. An image of Sean Nan and Howard Kwong, members of a gay youth group for Asian Americans called In the Gap. A photograph of the man behind the AIDS Memorial Quilt Project, Cleve Jones, and some of the 140 members of the Lesbian and Gay Bands of America who performed at the inauguration of President Bill Clinton in '93. Next, we have the at times infamous works by Catherine Opie. Brief bio here: she was born in 1961 in small-town Ohio and received a camera as a kid for a birthday gift after having shown interest in the field. She showed a strong preference towards community documentation sort of work. She went on to receive a BFA from the San Fran Art Institute in '85 and an MFA from CalArts in '88. Opie has taught at UCLA since 2001 and has received many awards, including the President's Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Women's Caucus for Art in '09 and the U.S. Artist Fellowship in '06. Now, the reason that she is at times infamous is that her career has been marked by artistic and classical portrait depictions of people either in kink dress or with visible results of BDSM activities. The Guardian sums her up by saying, quote, "Since the 1980s, the U.S. photographer has preserved queer lives through portraiture, challenged ideas about the nuclear home, and documented moments of solidarity and uncertainty in her work, which is often touching and shocking." Touching and shocking is a great way to summarize her works because there's a tenderness inherent in them despite the visual representations of pain. There's a sense of respect that comes through Opie's lens. There's a care in the way that the bodies are stylized, embellished, and adorned, a sort of architecture, as the publication Phaidon argues. This is likely because the sitters at this time were all members of her own chosen family, her closest friends, with whom she felt at home. The very in-your-face nature of the representations of pain is kind of confused, juxtaposed within itself with the sense of closeness and value of the person behind the lens that Opie creates in the same image. There's a closeness to the subject that you can't escape. Opie herself has stated that she encourages her sitters to look through the lens in order to look through the viewer a bit. She aims to have the sitter take a really special place, a sort of dreamy and confident one in the viewer's heads. And to accomplish that, she creates these dignified and elegant, despite their controversial content, images of people who were, and you know what, in some cases still are, ostracized, dismissed, considered perverts by larger society and even by others in the gay and lesbian communities who were more interested in mainstream acceptance than unification. So let's talk images of note. She's produced several individual series of notes. These include Being and Having, 1991, as well as Portraits, 1993 through 97. Of these, the Guggenheim says that she depicted her friends in the lesbian and gay communities of LA, mixing traditional portrait photography with less traditional subjects. The series Domestic, produced between 1995 and 98, however, is worth a closer look. The result of a so-called Great American Road Trip of 9,000 miles in length, completed by Opie and her dog, it resulted in a photographic series of lesbian families and couples in their home environments. What makes this series special and unique from Andrews is, according to the Guggenheim, it's, quote, the first major presentation of photographic subjects from outside of her regular daily experience, end quote. And despite this, it's still so personal in how we are seeing the subjects from within their own homes, within their own daily lives. The series also shows every possible race, age, urban, rural, gender, demographics, anything possible, all of the couplings across every corner of the USA, and therefore, in the words of the Guggenheim, is, quote, a photographic exploration into relationships that thrive in the privacy of the home, and provides a different perspective on the classic American dream that questions what constitutes the ideal home and the ideal family. Circling back for a moment to the series Being and Having, we ought to discuss Bo as her alter ego. The character has a cheesy fake mustache that covers the upper lip, very 80s cop style, fake tattoos, the whole thing. Opie developed Bo in part as an effort to document how masculinity, or at least her own masculinity, was experienced, performed, coded, socially constructed, expressed, and even, behind the camera, documented. What's fascinating about the Bo images is the parallels in the performances of masculinity and butch lesbian presentations at the time. They are notably uncomfortable because they feel staged, despite the supposed intimacy and frankness of the portrait style that they're in. Although Woe eventually became Bo when the iconic mustache went through the washer in her jeans pocket, there are several other images of Opie that caught the eye of critics and the public alike soon after. What is probably Opie's best known and at times hard to look at image is titled Self-Portrait / Pervert. She returns to self-portraiture throughout her career as she moved from early portraits of queer subcultures to pristine urban panoramas and later domestic life, but including herself as a sitter reminds us that she, as a photographer, does not stand apart from the groups that she documents. Rather, she is able to provide such insight into these communities and their own ways of living their lives because she's a member of them. Produced in 1994, the image touches on her professional development as much as her personal identity. Self-portrait / pervert is very in line with art historical norms, and that's possibly one of the reasons it's so jarring. It shows Opie seated from the knees up with her hands folded across her lap. Opie's making direct eye contact with the viewer. However, she does so through a black leather or latex, it's hard to tell, mask. Though she's wearing pants, she is topless. And there are, I feel the need to do a slight trigger warning here because there are piercings and there is some cutting happening in this image, but it's very intentional. So if you don't want to hear about it, skip the next minute, but here's what it is. There are rows of what appear to be metallic nails going through her skin all the way up both arms from wrist to shoulder, as well as the word pervert scrolled out in script etched into the skin of her chest above a double leaf design. It's graphic, and the paleness of her skin, the bloodiness of the writing stands out all the more against the paisley background of black and gold. If you are skipping, feel free to come back in now. So with the body positioning as well as the backdrop, lots of art historical references to be made. In fact, the background and the color of it were referenced by many of our sources today as an allusion to the master of the Northern Renaissance, Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein the Younger lived approximately 1497 through 1543 and was known for this royal-like style, which Opie has said in a Guggenheim interview she is looking to replicate. Self-portrait pervert continues to be such a shocking and such a fruitful image to examine because it is an almost unprecedented instance of visual normalization or even depiction, period, of kink in fine art, especially ones that cause, bodily, potentially long-term harm. Opie allows us to see something incredibly personal, almost confessional, and in that sense, appeals to our own sense of vulnerability, our own humanity, to try to understand longings and desires and how they might be different for other people and how expressions of how that might be different for other people is okay. Since the 90s, especially that image, Opie has shifted into various group photography, other styles, and concerns with natural spaces as well as processes. And last but certainly not least, we have our girl, Nan Goldin. Goldin was born in DC in 1953, but she was raised in Boston, although she left home at age 14 and began her photographic work with schooling in Massachusetts at 16. She gained attention for her works with the trans community at that point in her life, but after a 1978 move to New York City and subsequent documentation of her life and of the queer scene that she was involved in, the impact and importance of her work became recognized at a much larger scale. So major ideas, her career at large. Golden has been quoted as saying, "The camera is as much a part of my everyday life as talking or eating or sex." The Gagosian Gallery says that she has transformed the role of photography in contemporary art. Her photographs and moving image works address essential themes of identity, love, sexuality, addiction, and mortality. Uniting art and activism, Golden has confronted the HIV/AIDS epidemic since the 1980s and today brings international attention to the overdose crisis, end quote. And what a convenient segue for our works of the day. There's no doubt that at the height of the AIDS crisis, she was producing works that unflinchingly documented the struggles, the courage required to be a community person living in such an incredibly scary and devastating time. Golden was not afraid to take images of the taboo, of domestic violence, substance abuse, death, illness, all sorts of very heart-wrenching topics that make the moments of joy that show up in her photographs all the more impactful. If there's one production that embodies her ability to do that, it's likely her monograph, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, produced in 1968. That one documents the post-Stonewall gay subculture and includes lots of images of Golden's family and friends. The ballad speaks to all of the joy, all of the hope, and all of the anger and pain of the era. The entire monograph is a masterpiece, but to point out a few images that capture these emotions, first, Jimmy Paulette after the parade, 1991, Gaucho kissing Jillies, Paris, 1993, and especially Cookie at Vittorio's casket, New York City, 1989. Golden's work has broadened since the 80s to general themes of spirituality, loneliness, and mortality not related to any specifically queer relationships or figures. Golden has also become deeply involved in the overdose and opioid crisis with various organizations, artistic efforts, namely This Will Not End Well, a retrospective focused on Golden's slideshows and video installations that is traveling after its origin at Moderna Musette in 2022. Oh my god, I thought I just saw a lizard crawl up my door of my apartment to my bedroom, and I was about to scream straight into that mic. Whew. Anyways, lots of other projects that Golden has gotten involved in, and I am glad there are not critters in my apartment. Okay, honeys, those are your three big artists, your three big photographic series of gay America in the 80s and 90s and what it looked like then, as well as a general visual history of all things gay, albeit a bit Western leaning. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you're ready for business and all sorts of other great things to come in the upcoming week. Take care of yourselves. Pray the lizards stay away from me, and I will talk to you all soon. This podcast was created, produced, written, posted, edited, and fact-checked by master's graduate Celia Bugnow. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.